Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the latest in this series of talks from the Peak Northern Football Society. And I'm very pleased to welcome tonight Jack Cornish, who is head of the Paths team at the Ramblers. We're looking forward to hearing what Jack has to tell us about the latest moves with the government and what has been happening in the Ramblers.
Okay, brilliant. I'll crack on then. So yeah, thanks very much for inviting me today. So I've got sort of a variety of things, I suppose, to talk about that I've got in my presentation. So one is just to introduce, as I said, I know that many of you will know it already, but this sort of general issue of lost rights of way. Then I was going to talk a bit about what the Ramblers have been doing and are still planning to do. As David said, it's a particularly interesting time with the 2026 date repeal, so I'm going to talk a bit about that, and then also, as I've got the opportunity, talk about some of the work of the Ramblers and our new Paths team, and hopefully maybe even how we can sort of work together even more in the coming months and years. And then there'll be some time for any questions. It's one of these presentations where I haven't really timed myself, so hopefully I won't run too short or too long, but it's always good to have more time for questions, I think. So but yeah, so, and again, I know a lot of this, I'm talking to people who know a lot of this already, so do forgive me, but it's just some reminder really. So obviously we've got 140,000 miles of public rights of way in England and Wales. They're footpaths, bridleways, restricted byways, and byways open to all traffic. The Ramblers are interested in all of those because walkers can use all of them. And as many of you will know, they're legally recorded on the definitive map. It's always an interesting term, the definitive map, because there isn't such a thing as the definitive map. There are 157, I think it is, across England and Wales. And they are the legal record of public rights of way where people can walk, cycle, ride a horse and cart across England and Wales. And again, many of you know this, but whilst rights of way have existed for hundreds of years, the concept of them, the reality of them, they were only started to be recorded on the definitive map with the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act in 1949. And I think that isn't, maybe not in these circles that we're talking today, but I think nationally that is an overlooked landmark piece of legislation, and it's a landmark piece of legislation of the Attlee government that I think sits alongside things like the National Health Service, because it's about recording, of public rights, and they are rights to use by the public, and I think it is an overlooked thing that people can often overlook. So that's some of the context of rights of way. And those rights of way were, I don't know if my thing's in the way, there we go. Those rights of way were mapped by councils from the 1950s, 60s. I think the last one formally wasn't completed until the 80s, although there is still some local authorities that I don't think properly have a definitive map. And there were many issues with those. They were working with local parish and community councils. They're working with local people to get those mapped, and paths were missed off. This is I found this in this quote that's on the screen now. I found in a local newspaper down in the southwest. And this was one of the sort of reactions there were to those mapping of rights of way. Why do we need this? Children no longer walk to school. The postman of the future apparently would be using helicopters. And it was tantamount to the people in the rural areas telling MPs to survey the Palace of Westminster. It's people knew where they could walk and where they could travel around their local communities. It wasn't needed. And some of this opposition, I think, led to some of the gaps that we find in our definitive maps, because it's worth saying what people were trying to do when they were mapping these rights of way. They were mapping things that existed at the time or existed historically. So councils were asked to, dive back through the records, through old maps and old records to find rights of way, and to talk to people on the ground about where they walked or rode around the countryside. But it was a very much an incomplete and an imperfect exercise. So we ended up with definitive maps that are by no means definitive. And again, this is slightly picked at random example of some of the issues, and I know many of you will have local examples of paths that don't make sense and of paths that are not recorded on the Ordnance Survey map or on the definitive map. These examples I've got are actually within a very small area of Lincolnshire that I was walking last summer, and you can see here, just as a way of example, there's 3 rights of way, 2 bridleways and a footpath that seemingly stop in the middle of nowhere. If you notice, you might see those dots, the black dots, and that's a parish boundary. So this is a classic example, I think, of where paths were left off the definitive map. These are, the councils worked with parish the sort of county councils worked with parish councils, and obviously in this case, one parish council either, one remembered to put the paths on and one forgot, or one chose to put the paths on and one chose not to. And so you've got these 3 rights of way that stop in the middle of nowhere. And actually, at least 2 of these are no longer accessible. They are actually closed off to the public. So it's not just a legal thing, it's actually reality on the ground. And looking at the old maps, this is where those paths went. And you can see they linked up, they went to that community, they linked up between villages, and those paths are no longer there. So again, it's a very small area of very rural Lincolnshire. There's paths that just, there's not even a dead end. They're just completely missed off. And these are, the blue lines are potential lost rights of way. And the green lines are obviously the rights of way that we see on the map now. And you can see here where there's whole linkages that are just missing from the map entirely. One other thing I thought I would just again, as a by way of example, in the same area, sometimes you can see why paths were maybe later destroyed or were destroyed. This is an airfield, and you can see that these paths just stop at essentially what is the boundary of the airfield. You've got a bridleway up here and a footpath down there that just stop in the middle of nowhere. And I actually walked along these paths, including the one alongside the wood going down on the right here. And again, the lack of access is not just a piece of legal, of arcane legal thing, but it's actually, lack of access on the ground. And from the signs here, you can see that the landowner was not keen for me to go and walk on the rights of way that could have been there across the airfield. So that's, again, just a very quick overview of some of the issue. And so the Ramblers Don't Lose Your Way project has been running now for about just over 3 years. And it is our project to support any member of the public, any of our volunteers, any new volunteers, anyone really, with finding these lost rights of way, with researching them, and hopefully with applying for them to get them put back on the map. So in terms of what we've been up to, we just before the pandemic, seems like quite a long time ago now, we launched a tool which enabled members of the public to map potential lost rights of way using the old Ordnance Survey map from about 1900 and the Bartholomew map, which is more of a sort of a road and cycling map from about the same date, to find potential lost rights of way. And we found 49,000 miles of those in England and Wales. And the process and the process behind actually getting one of these paths put back on the map is really underpinned by the piece of English law, which is once a highway, always a highway. So if something was a right of way in the past, if it's never been legally stopped up, then it should still be a right of way now. And as many of you will know, footpaths and bridleways are as much a highway as the A1 are, and you know, they are public rights, and they are the Queen's Highway. And if it was a highway once, it should always be a highway. Now I've got a picture on the right there. That is actually a sculpture of Richard the Lionheart. The reason I've got Richard the Lionheart in a talk about rights of way and lost rights of way is that we can go back and we can use evidence to prove highway status and to prove public status back to the date of Richard the Lionheart's succession to the throne, which from memory is the 1st of July 1189, because that is the date of time immemorial in English law. So legal time goes back to the 1st of July 1189. I think it's a Thursday from memory, but I might be wrong about that. And so essentially, you know, volunteers, it'd be great if there's people here that would like to volunteer, but collect evidence and submit that to the local highway authority that, you know, the public used this path in the past and therefore they should be able to use it now. I haven't got slides on all the different types of evidence, but I can always answer questions about that. But again, I didn't want to repeat some of the things that may have come up in the previous conversations. And I've got at the bottom, submit by the 1st of January 2026 from a previous presentation. But obviously there's a question mark about that, and I can come on to that. I do have in the presentation as well, just, you know, I'm talking to an audience that I think understands the importance of these paths. But I do have some of my photographs when I you know, I'm always going out walking across the whole of Britain, and some of the sort of historic paths I've walked on in relatively recent times. This is a really worn down hollow way in Dorset, and this is, you know, taken last I think it was last June. And I suppose I've got this as an example of the deep history of the paths. This goes from an Iron Age hill fort, and it's sort of proper hardy country, and you can see how, you know, partly it's geology, but partly it's people's feet and hooves have worn down some of this landscape over generations. And I think for me, the importance of claiming these paths isn't just about utility, and it isn't just about us walking now, but it's their status as a part of our collective history and a part of our working class history as well. Like we, you know, paths are an expression of how ordinary people have interacted with their landscape over generations. So I thought I'd include a couple of my favorite photographs as well. Now, as David said at the beginning, we, you know, I think it was around the end of February, the government announced that they plan to scrap that deadline of the 1st of January 2026. That deadline was introduced in the Countryside and Rights of Way Act in 2000, and it essentially said that any paths not submitted to the local authority by the 1st of January 2026, based on historical evidence, would not be able to be saved. But the government announced they plan to scrap that deadline. Before I go on to that, here's another of my favourite photographs. This is a path in near Droitwich, and this is supposedly following the line of a saltway out from Droitwich, which existed back to the Saxon charters at least. So again, another part of that history that's expressed in our paths. So I think there, you know, I think David said that, you know, hopefully I can give some context behind this announcement. So I thought I'd just spend, you know, 5 minutes saying what does repeal mean, and why do we think we ended up here. So I think the first headline thing to say is that this is a significant victory for walkers, for cyclists, for riders, for anyone who likes access in the countryside, because I think it will mean, I've got a question mark there, but I don't know why, because I think it will mean that thousands of more paths are saved because of this. You know, we don't have this once the repeal comes through, we won't have this arbitrary deadline for the paths to be added to the map, and the definitive map will still be able to be amended based on historical evidence long into the future. So that's, the headline is that is a fantastic piece of news. We are working with DEFRA to make sure that it's actually confirmed in legislation in both England and Wales. It's worth pointing out that the recent announcement was from the UK government about England, but previously the Welsh government had made a similar announcement, and in both countries we are yet to see that actually in the legislation. Now it gets a bit technical, but in theory, if nothing happened between now and the 1st of January 2026, there would not be a cut-off date, because despite the fact that it was in the Countryside and Rights of Way Act, there is still a piece of enabling legislation that needs to be put through to commence it. Now, we don't want to rely on that, because we want to see it confirmed, the actual the repeal of the cutoff date completely in legislation, because to be honest, leaving it so it just doesn't get commenced is very messy, and it has other consequences, some of which I'm sure will be unforeseen. The government also announced, alongside this repeal of the 2026 cutoff date, a couple of other pieces of news. One is about what's called the right to apply. Now, again, forgive me if some of this gets too technical, but essentially, landowners and occupiers have the ability to ask a local authority currently for a diversion or an extinguishment of a right of way over their land. That is not a right currently. The government intends to bring forward the right to apply. So that essentially means that landowners will be able to not only ask a local authority, but they will have a formal right to apply for an extinguishment or a diversion of a path, which, on the face of it, sounds worrying, and it is of some concern. But I think I can hopefully give some reassurance, because delving into this, essentially it gives them the right to apply, but it doesn't change the test over which those extinguishments or diversions can be made. So an extinguishment will not be made if it is substantially less convenient to the public, or if it affects the public's enjoyment of a path, which is quite a high bar to pass. So it doesn't change the tests. It also, alongside that, the government is intending to allow local authorities, but also the planning inspectorate, the ability to recoup all their costs from applicants as well. So that will be a barrier to some landowners, willy-nilly asking for all of the paths on their land to be diverted or extinguished, because there will be full cost recovery from the local authority for that. I think the main concern for me with the right to apply comes from the effect that it may have on an already overloaded system. We know that local authorities have seen 12 years worth of austerity. We know that's taken a massive toll, particularly on rights of way, alongside lots of other of their functions. But I think we've seen it on rights of way that local authorities do not have the resources they should be putting into maintaining that network, into processing applications for paths to be added to the network, and also for dealing with applications for changes to the network. And I think this right to apply will see more applications, and I worry about the effect on local authority resources for that, although maybe their ability to recoup costs will help somewhat. I also worry about the effect that it will have on volunteers as well. I know that the Peak and Northern, as well as the Ramblers, are massively dedicated volunteers, look for all these applications and they respond to them. They go on the ground and see what changes would these would these applications, what effect would these changes make on the network? And so, I do worry that if we're just getting loads more applications to change the network, that it doesn't just have a material effect on authorities, it has a material effect on volunteers as well. And that is a significant issue. The other thing that the government announced is that some of you may know the Deregulation Act, which was passed in 2015, was aiming to create an easier system for making applications and for processing applications based on historical evidence. And that was supposed to be a system that was easier for landowners, for highway authorities, and for applicants as well. But the government are not, as far as we know, currently intending to bring in much of that Deregulation Act, many of those Deregulation Act provisions. So there are certainly things that the Ramblers think will make, just obvious things that will make things easier for everyone, that we are disappointed. It's not looking like they're on the agenda to be implemented anytime soon. A simple example is the fact that local authorities have to advertise every application in local newspapers. I mean, the amount of cost and time that takes, whereas actually it doesn't have much of a material impact, is something that it feels like a no-brainer that should go, but unfortunately it will not. And there's loads of other parts of the Deregulation Act that we don't see coming into effect anytime soon. And I think whilst I'm talking about the Deregulation Act, it's probably worth saying why we think the government made this announcement. I think partly the increase in noise about this issue has certainly helped. The Ramblers and the British Horse Society and the Peak and Northern and many others, making a fuss and talking about this issue has helped. But ultimately, I think the reason they've done it is that to bring in the 2026 date, it requires a lot of work, legislative work for DEFRA, and a lot of detailed regulations that will make sure that, for instance, paths in current use are saved because the original legislation is not clear, and things like that. And I think essentially, with the changes to agricultural payments, with the new Environment Bill, all of those things that DEFRA have got on their work plan, I think ultimately it was being too complicated. Which I think, is, and the fact that the Deregulation Act provisions were passed in 2015 and have still not been implemented 7 years later, I think is a demonstration of the complexity of this area. But obviously I can take many more questions about that if it's helpful. So what's next for Don't Lose Your Way? So we are committed to saving paths and putting them back on the map. Without the 2026 date, it doesn't mean that the work doesn't continue, and the importance of having these paths recorded is still there, so that they can be accessible now and they can be accessible long into the future. That work, we want to, our project continues, and our work to encourage and support volunteers continues. There's a couple of ways that maybe you can help if you're interested. We've got our map of those 49,000 miles of potential lost rights of way, and we do know there are any potential lost rights of way. We have the ability for any member of the public to help us prioritise those, either to sort of weed out things that maybe have already been applied for or that have been legally diverted at some point or extinguished, but also to say which ones are the most important, links in the network to focus some of the research. Also, we'd be fantastic if people were interested in joining in with the research. Either, there's loads of different things you can do, either just sort of digitizing things in the archives or actually putting in applications to put these paths back on the map. And we'll be doing a bigger push for people to join in that research later this year. And we're keen to work with other organisations like the Peak and Northern but also other stakeholders, including landowners. I think one thing that the repeal does give us is the ability to actually take our time with some of those relationships. Instead of it's just about putting in more and more applications, which is important, it's also about, well, you know, we found all these potential paths on this landowner's land. Can we have a conversation about the most important one of those, instead of, you know, that would work for most people? So I think it just gives us a little bit of that breathing room there. This is the last photo I'm going to show of some of my path walking recently. This is in Ramblers in Snowdonia, just opposite Snowdon itself. And this is an old miner's path that goes up the mountainside to the slate quarries. And again, I think it just demonstrates that place that paths play in sort of connecting our history, and again that ordinary working class history of Britain. So I'm not really sure what time I'm on, but I just wanted to quickly mention some of the wider work that the Ramblers do, which I know many of you will be aware of, but we've recently created a paths team at the Ramblers, and that's where my head of paths role comes from. And it's a new team, but it's with work that we've always done. It's just bringing it together and sort of linking it all up, so hopefully we can be more effective. And that work of the paths team and the volunteers we support involves, you know, we have a network of path volunteers at what we, for us, it's area and group level across England and Wales, who, like with the Peak of Northern, look at all those rights of way, those changes, look at planning applications, lobby councils. They make applications to add paths to the map, and do an amazing amount of work. And we've got several thousand of those volunteers across England and Wales. So we're supporting those. We also, I see a really important role of the Ramblers in advising the public about their rights and about what they can do if those rights are challenged or subverted. So we help thousands of members of the public a year with public advice around rights of way, and support them, you know, sometimes for months on end with resolving issues on paths and rights of way. We also take casework and legal action against landowners, against local authorities, to assert the rights of the public and to make sure that, you know, we are that our rights of way network, you know, is invested in and is open for people to use. And that's an area I want to increase. I want the Ramblers to become even more activists and you know, to have a sort of more muscular role in protecting those rights. And also we've got teams that do physical work on the ground, that, you know, that fix path surfaces, that install gates instead of stiles, that build literal bridges, that clear vegetation. And it all comes under the work of the paths team, all comes under, you know, the three areas that I talk about a lot, which is our mission to protect, expand and improve the network for all. And there's lots of exciting things coming up around that. Silence.
Thank you so much, Jack. That was very interesting and, of course, very, very topical and of central interest to all of us here in Peak and Northern.